there is a quality to ancient places that resists easy description. You can feel it in the way the light moves, not filtering through the trees the way it does in ordinary forests, but diffusing, softening, arriving at the ground already transformed into something older, something slower. You can feel it in the sound, or rather, in the particular texture of the silence between sounds. The creek below you, the wind above you, and between them, nothing. A nothing that feels occupied. The Great Smoky Mountains sit on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, straddling the spine of the southern Appalachians at a point that geologists will tell you represents some of the most ancient exposed rock on the surface of the Earth. 300 million years of planetary history pressed into ridgelines and creek valleys and hollows, so deep that the sun clears them only briefly at midday before retreating again behind the surrounding peaks. 13 million people come here every year, more than Yellowstone, more than the Grand Canyon, more than any other national park in the country, by a margin that researchers find difficult to fully explain in terms of conventional visitor motivation. People come for the wildlife. The black bears, the elk reintroduced in the early 2000s, the extraordinary diversity of salamander species found nowhere else on Earth. They come for the wildflowers in April and May, the leaf color in October, the snow along the high ridges in winter. But there is something else that draws people here, something that operates below the level of conscious articulation. A pull toward the feeling that this place holds, something it has not yet shown you. That the visible landscape, extraordinary as it is only a surface. That beneath your feet, beneath the soil and the root systems and the bedrock layers, there is another story. Tonight, we are going to follow that feeling downward. We are going to trace a body of evidence, scattered, imperfect, methodologically complicated, and persistently convergent, that suggests something extraordinary exists beneath the most visited national park in the United States. Evidence drawn from the oral traditions of people who have lived in these mountains for thousands of years. From the journals and letters of 18th and 19th century surveyors who stumbled onto things they could not categorize. From the quiet footnotes of geological surveys that described anomalies and then moved on. From independent researchers who pursued questions the academic mainstream had declined to ask. And from the physical geology of the mountains themselves, which turn out to be precisely the kind of environment where the extraordinary has always been plausible and where it has been systematically overlooked. This is not a story that resolves cleanly. If you are looking for certainty, for someone to tell you definitively that the tunnels are real, or definitively that they are not, this is not that story. Real mysteries do not resolve that way. What real mysteries offer instead is something more valuable: the accumulation of evidence, the recognition of pattern, and the honest acknowledgement of what we do not know and why we do not know it. What lies beneath the Smoky Mountains is that kind of mystery. We have been circling it for centuries. Tonight, we go inside it. The Cherokee called these mountains Shaconage, the place of blue smoke. But they also called them something harder to translate: a threshold. a place where the boundary between the world above and the world below was thinner than elsewhere, more permeable, more alive with the memory of what passed through it. If you are listening to this at night, if you are settling in for sleep and you have chosen this as your companion into the dark, then you have already done something that the people who lived in these mountains for thousands of years would have recognized. You have turned toward the old question, the one that never entirely goes away, no matter how many highways are built above it, or how many hiking trails are blazed across its surface. What is underneath? Let the mountains breathe their blue smoke into the sky above you. Let the mist that never quite lifts settle into the valleys of your thinking. And let us begin. Echoes of the Nunnehi. When memory becomes geography before we go underground, we need to understand what underground meant to the people who knew these mountains longest. And to do that, we need to understand something about the nature of oral tradition. Not the romanticized version, not the academic dismissal, but the actual thing, as it functions in cultures that have maintained it with discipline and care across many generations. There is a persistent assumption in Western intellectual culture that oral tradition is the childhood phase of knowledge, imprecise, prone to elaboration, eventually superseded by written records. This assumption is not supported by evidence. What the evidence actually shows is something considerably more interesting and considerably more demanding of our attention. Researchers studying indigenous oral traditions in Australia documented something remarkable in the early 21st century. They found multiple distinct Aboriginal language groups maintaining oral traditions that correctly described coastlines, river mouths, and geological features as they existed more than 10,000 years ago, before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age and permanently altered those landscapes. The descriptions were specific enough and accurate enough to be matched with geological surveys of the submerged former coastlines. This was not approximation. It was not impressionistic poetic memory. It was cartographic precision, maintained across hundreds of generations. The people who maintained those traditions were not operating in some primitive pre-scientific mode of knowledge transmission. They were operating within a sophisticated epistemological system, one that treated geographic information as sacred knowledge, transmitted with the same rigor that other cultures would apply to written legal codes or mathematical proofs. The consequence of inaccuracy was understood to be real and serious. The stakes were high. The information was therefore preserved with corresponding care. The Cherokee people maintained that same understanding about their own oral traditions. What was passed down across generations was not merely stories. It was a record of actual events, actual places, actual geographic features encoded in narrative form, a technology for preserving information across time in the absence of writing. And one of the things that Cherokee oral tradition consistently preserved across multiple distinct Cherokee-speaking communities, across centuries of contact with European culture, and the profound disruptions that contact entailed, was the account of the Nunnehi. The Nunnehi, more than mythology, The word translates approximately as the people who live anywhere, or, in some versions, the travelers. But those translations, while accurate to the surface meaning of the syllables, miss the full weight of what the Nunnehi represent in Cherokee traditional knowledge. The Nunnehi are not spirits, they are not ghosts. They are not beings who exist on a separate metaphysical plane, accessible only through altered states of consciousness or ritual intermediaries. In the Cherokee telling, consistent across multiple regional traditions and recorded by ethnographers who worked directly with Cherokee informants across more than a century, the Nunnehi are fully physical beings. They breathe the same air. They inhabit the same geological reality. They can be seen, touched, spoken to, and helped by human beings under certain circumstances. And they can do the same in return. What distinguishes them from ordinary human beings is where they live and what they know. They live, according to the tradition, in great towns beneath the mountains and beneath the major rivers, in chambers and passages underground that were ancient when the first Cherokee ancestors arrived in the region. They possess knowledge of healing, of plant medicine, of practices that the Cherokee themselves sought out in times of extreme need. They are described as friendly toward the Cherokee, not universally, not automatically, but fundamentally well-disposed toward the human communities they share the landscape with. James Mooney, the Smithsonian ethnographer who spent years in the late 19th century documenting Cherokee oral tradition, recorded the Nunnehi accounts in remarkable detail. His work, published by the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1900 under the title Myths of the Cherokee, remains a foundational academic source for Cherokee traditional knowledge. In that work, Mooney noted something that is easy to overlook but critically important. Cherokee informants consistently described the underground towns of the Nunnehi not as mythological spaces, not as symbolic representations of spiritual reality, but as real places with specific locations. Places that specific living individuals had personal knowledge of, either through direct experience or through the verified accounts of known family members. This is the precise distinction that matters. A mythological underworld is impressionistic, somewhere below, somewhere beyond, accessible under symbolic conditions to symbolic figures in symbolic narratives. The Nunnehi underground is geographic. On this ridge, along this creek valley, at this depth, with these specific features. The language of the accounts is the language of place knowledge, not the language of cosmological allegory. When a Cherokee elder pointed toward a particular slope of a particular ridge and said, "The entrance is somewhere near there," they were not speaking poetically. They were giving directions, imprecise directions or perhaps, shaped by the deliberate vagueness that protected sacred sites from casual intrusion, but directions nonetheless. Directions to somewhere real. What the academic system did. With this information, Mooney documented the Nunnehi accounts with care and seriousness. What essentially no mainstream researcher did afterward was take the next logical step. Connecting the oral tradition accounts to the physical evidence of underground passages that had been accumulating in the margins of the documentary record, since the late 18th century, and asking whether the two bodies of information might be describing the same thing from different perspectives. This is a methodological gap of significant proportions. In fields like geology and ecology, the cross-referencing of indigenous knowledge with physical evidence is now recognized as a legitimate and valuable research methodology. In North American archaeology, as it developed through most of the 20th century, that cross-referencing was not standard practice. Oral tradition was treated as a cultural artifact, something to be documented and interpreted symbolically, but not something to be treated as an independent verification system for physical claims about the landscape. The reasons for this are partly philosophical and partly historical. And the historical reasons, in particular, tell a story about American intellectual culture that is uncomfortable and important in equal measure. We will come to that story. But first, let us trace what the early European visitors to these mountains actually found or thought they found when they descended from the surface and entered the rock. The marginal records. What the surveyors wrote down and then forgot. The formal documentary record of colonial and post-colonial North America is organized around significance. What was economically important got documented carefully. What threatened or advanced political interests got documented carefully. What people understood to be historically meaningful got documented carefully. What people encountered but could not categorize. What surprised them, what puzzled them, what fit no existing framework, but seemed worth noting for some reason they could not entirely articulate, got jotted in the margins, in the postscripts of letters, in the footnotes of journals that were never primarily about the thing they had seen, in the asides of land surveys focused on mineral assessments and property boundary descriptions. The tunnels of the Smoky Mountains, whatever they are, first entered the documentary record in exactly this way. Not as discoveries, not as subject matter, as margins. The letter of Amos Whitmore, sometime in the final years of the 18th century. The exact date is not established, and the letter itself has never been formally catalogued by any mainstream historical archive. A surveyor working in the mountain's nest terrain along what is now the Tennessee-North Carolina border wrote to a professional colleague about something he had encountered in the course of his work. The letter exists. It is referenced in a small number of independent research compilations, and physical copies are reportedly held in at least 2 private archive collections in the region. Its authenticity has not been formally challenged. It has also not been formally verified by any mainstream institution. It occupies the characteristic position of the Smoky Mountain documentary evidence: present, referenced, and uninvestigated. The surveyor, his name rendered variously as Amos Whitmore or Amos Whitmore in the accounts that cite the letter, described an encounter with what he called a worked passage in the rock, a passage he specified, wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, a passage that descended at an angle into the mountain's interior for a distance he estimated at considerably more than 100 yards, before the failing of his torch made further exploration impractical. 3 details in his description have attracted the attention of researchers who have encountered the letter. First, the smoothness of the walls. He noted that he touched them repeatedly, the action of someone checking, comparing, trying to resolve a perceptual puzzle, and that they felt smoother than natural erosion would produce. The specific texture of naturally water-worn rock in metamorphic terrain is rough, irregular, fractured along the foliation planes. What he described was different, deliberately different, his account implies. Second, the markings. He mentioned faint markings on the walls that he could not identify. He did not elaborate, which is itself notable. A man who could not read the markings but was certain enough of their existence to record their presence without embellishment and without interpretation, just the fact. Third, the temperature. He noted that the air inside the passage was warmer than the outside air, which he found surprising given the depth of the passage and the time of year. Natural caves in temperate regions maintain a relatively constant temperature approximately equal to the mean annual surface temperature of the surrounding area. In the Smoky Mountains, that is roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool, stable, independent of surface conditions. What Whitmore described was something different. Warmth that did not belong to the rock. We will return to the significance of that thermal anomaly. For now, note only its consistency with other accounts collected across more than 2 centuries from observers who had no access to each other's reports. The pattern of independent marginalia Whitmore's letter is not isolated. It is the first significant documented instance of a pattern that recurs with remarkable consistency across the following 2 centuries. A Cherokee guide in the mid-1800s reportedly led a small party of settlers toward what he described as one of the old doors, a term that other sources suggest was used more broadly among Cherokee elders to refer to access points to the underground system referenced in their traditions. The party did not enter. The guide became agitated and led them away, offering an explanation that the surviving account rendered approximately as, "It is not safe in the dying season." What that phrase meant in its original context, whether it referred to a seasonal spiritual prohibition of physical danger specific to that time of year, or something else entirely, has not been adequately investigated. A mining survey conducted for a private land speculation company in the mid-19th century produced a report describing at least 3 locations where natural cavern formations appeared to connect to passages that bore signs of deliberate modification. The survey was commissioned to assess mineral potential in the area. It was not shared publicly. A later document from the Tennessee State Geological Office referenced this survey's findings as anomalous and recommended further investigation. The further investigation apparently never occurred. A local history of Sevier County, Tennessee, published in the 1880s, mentioned in a brief passage that settlers in one particular valley had discovered what they described as Indian caves that appeared to have been made rather than formed, with walls bearing marks that no natural process could explain. A Works Progress Administration oral history, collected in the 1930s as part of that agency's extensive Appalachian oral history project recorded the account of an elderly woman whose grandfather had encountered a passage in the mountains that he believed to be very old and very deep. A Cherokee neighbor had told him, according to her account, that the passage was one of many, and that they ran throughout the mountains like veins in a body. A Knoxville newspaper article from the 1890s described the discovery by a hunting party of an entrance to what the account called a worked cavern in the eastern Smokies. The hunters declined to enter beyond the opening because of the smell of the air. One of them described it as unlike any cave he had encountered before. Not the cold mineral smell of natural caverns, but something warmer and more complex. 6 documents, 6 different time periods, 6 different locations. 6 observers with no apparent connection to each other. 6 reports of the same thing. The signature of coincidence is uniformity. The same story told the same way by people who borrowed it from each other. What these accounts show is the opposite. Variation in specific details, location, depth, features observed, reaction of the observer, embedded in a consistent underlying structure. Different encounters with the same category of phenomenon. That is not coincidence. That is pattern. And pattern, in the absence of adequate investigation, is what we have. The core dilemma: when does stone remember a hand? Before we can evaluate what the historical accounts describe, we need to understand what the geology of the Smoky Mountains is actually capable of producing on its own. Because the most important thing you need to know about the underground of these mountains is this: the extraordinary is geologically normal here. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest on the planet. At their peak, roughly 300 to 350 million years ago, they rivaled the modern Himalayas in height. A chain of peaks that would have been breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. What we see today is what time has left after 300 million years of erosion. The metamorphic basement of a mountain system that has been worn to its bones. That metamorphic basement contains features that have been forming, evolving, and changing for an almost incomprehensible span of time. And it contains, within its complexity, 2 distinct mechanisms for underground passage formation. 2 kinds of underground. The first is familiar dissolution, when slightly acidic groundwater moves through limestone or marble, calcium carbonate rocks that react chemically with acid. It dissolves the rock over time and creates caverns. The result is the classic Appalachian cave: smooth walls, regular chambers, spectacular formations. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, with more than 400 miles of surveyed passages, is the largest known cave system in the world, formed by exactly this process. Luray Caverns in Virginia, a few hundred miles northeast of the Smokies, draws hundreds of thousands of visitors annually to its chamber of stalactites and stalagmites. These are limestone caves. The Smoky Mountains are not primarily limestone. They are primarily metamorphic rock, the schist and gneiss that form the eroded remnant of that ancient mountain chain. Metamorphic rock does not dissolve readily. It fractures. Metamorphic cave formation is the second mechanism, and it operates differently. When tectonic stress fractures metamorphic rock, And when hydrothermal fluids move through those fractures over millions of years, and when mechanical erosion by groundwater widens and extends those fractures, the result is a different kind of underground passage, narrower, more irregular in cross-section, more complex in three-dimensional routing than dissolution caves, but potentially very extensive, because fracture networks in metamorphic rock can extend for enormous distances along the regional stress field. What this means for the Smoky Mountains is that an extensive natural fracture passage network is not merely plausible, it is expected. The geology produces it. The question that the historical accounts raise is not whether underground passages exist. They do. The question is whether some of those passages show evidence of human engagement, deliberate modification, systematic use, constructed features. That is the distinction that matters. And to understand what that distinction looks like in practice, we need to look at a piece of evidence that should be far more widely known than it is. The marble lens problem. Within the dominant metamorphic sequence of the Smoky Mountains, there are interspersed lenses of marble, isolated deposits of that calcium carbonate rock that elsewhere produces vast cave systems. These marble lenses follow the foliation of the surrounding rock, meaning they are not randomly distributed, but occur in specific zones that can be mapped along the surface and extrapolated into the subsurface. Where marble lenses occur within metamorphic terrain, groundwater dissolves them from the inside, creating small, irregular, but potentially connected cave features embedded within the broader matrix of metamorphic fracture passages. The result is a hybrid underground, natural fracture passages in the metamorphic host rock, dissolution caverns in the marble lenses, connected where the two systems intersect. This hybrid architecture has a specific character that explains some of the variation in historical accounts. Some passages are described as smooth and regular, consistent with dissolution features in marble. Others are described as rougher and more irregular, consistent with natural fracture passages in the schist. If they are part of the same interconnected system, that variation is exactly what you would expect. The marble lenses in the Smoky Mountains have been mapped at the surface. Their subsurface extent has not been systematically investigated. This is a gap in the scientific record that an adequately funded geological survey could address, directly, rigorously, and without any appeal to anomalous or controversial data. The geology itself is the argument for investigation, and that investigation has not been made. The architecture of institutional silence. Why don't we know more? That is the question that everyone who spends serious time with the Smoky Mountain Tunnel evidence eventually arrives at. The pattern is consistent. The geological substrate is capable. The oral tradition is specific and geographically grounded. The documentary record, though fragmented, shows a convergence that is very difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. And yet, the formal investigation that this evidence calls for has never been conducted. No peer-reviewed study has systematically examined the claims. No institutional research program has set out to map the underground features of the Smoky Mountain region in relation to the historical accounts. No collaboration between academic geologists, archaeologists, and Cherokee cultural heritage professionals has been formally organized to address the question, why not? The answer has two layers. The first is logistical and administrative. The ordinary mechanics of how academic research gets funded and organized. The second is historical and political. The specific legacy of how North American archaeology developed as a discipline during the 19th century, and how that legacy has shaped the discipline's relationship to questions about pre-Columbian indigenous capability, the mound builder controversy, and its long shadow. For most of the 19th century, American intellectual culture maintained a position regarding the extraordinary archaeological record of indigenous North America that can only be described as a deliberate evasion of the obvious. The massive earthworks of the Mississippi Valley, some of them covering more ground than the largest pyramids of Egypt, some of them demonstrating astronomical alignment and geometric precision that could not have been achieved accidentally, were attributed by mainstream scholarship to anyone except the ancestors of the people actually living in North America. Vikings, Welsh princes, the lost tribes of Israel, survivors of Atlantis, ancient Egyptians who had somehow crossed the ocean. The specific candidate varied by theorist, but the underlying principle was consistent. The impressive structures could not have been made by Native Americans. Therefore, they were made by someone else. This was not a position driven by evidence. It was a position driven by political necessity. The argument that indigenous people had not built the significant structures that the landscape contained was used directly to justify the taking of that land. If the people living there had not truly built anything, had not, in the intellectual framework of the time, improved the land through the application of civilization, then the land was available for those who would. The mound builder controversy, as historians of science call it, was resolved definitively in favor of indigenous origin by the end of the 19th century, primarily through the work of Cyrus, Thomas, and the Bureau of Ethnology. The detailed excavation of mound sites across the Mississippi and Ohio valleys produced stratigraphic evidence, artifact associations, and continuities with historically documented indigenous cultures that made the case for Native American authorship irrefutable. But intellectual resolutions do not always translate immediately into disciplinary culture. The methodological conservatism that had been required to win the mound builder argument, the insistence on rigorous physical evidence, the skepticism toward extraordinary claims, the care in attribution, produced a discipline that remained cautious about asserting pre-Columbian construction of any kind, especially underground construction, which was seen as belonging to a different and more technically demanding category than earthwork mounds. The combination of this methodological conservatism with insufficient field research in the Smoky Mountains region specifically meant that the tunnel question was never seriously engaged. It appeared in footnotes and was set aside for more tractable problems. The intellectual apparatus for not taking it seriously was already in place, and the institutional incentive to dismantle that apparatus did not exist.
Fall
Through disciplinary cracks, there is a structural problem in American academic culture that goes beyond the specific history of 19th century archaeology. Many of the most interesting questions in pre-Columbian North American studies exist precisely at the intersection of multiple disciplines: geology, archaeology, anthropology, indigenous studies, archival history, and that intersection is where institutional support goes to die. Geology does not fund questions about human modification of natural features without archaeological evidence of human presence. Archaeology does not fund questions about underground geology without geological evidence of accessible passages. Anthropology treats oral tradition as cultural data rather than physical evidence. Indigenous studies lacks the technical equipment for underground survey, and none of these disciplines has a formal mechanism for pooling resources around a question that does not fit neatly within any single disciplinary framework. The Smoky Mountain Tunnel question falls through these cracks, not because the evidence is inadequate, not because the question is unimportant, but because the institutional architecture of American academic research was not designed for questions of this kind. Questions that require multiple disciplines to collaborate simultaneously, that combine indigenous knowledge with physical evidence, and that sit in a space where every individual component of the evidence is deniable in isolation, while the collective pattern is very difficult to dismiss. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination, active effort, a conscious decision to suppress. What produced the silence around the Smoky Mountain tunnels is something more mundane and more systemic. The ordinary operation of institutions that were organized around different priorities, and the natural human tendency to avoid questions that fall outside the frameworks within which careers are built and reputations are maintained. Understanding that silence, its mechanisms, its effects, its limits, is part of understanding what the evidence actually means. The man who went looking. Harold Lester's independent survey. Harold Lester was not an archaeologist. He was a retired geological survey engineer, a man who had spent his professional career assessing terrain, reading rock, interpreting subsurface conditions from surface evidence. When he turned his attention to the Western Smoky Mountains in the early 1970s, he brought to the question exactly the skills that the question required and exactly the institutional outsider status that ensured his findings would not be taken seriously by the institutions that should have followed up on them. Lester spent a substantial portion of that summer at locations in the Western Smokies that had been referenced in 19th century accounts. Accounts he had spent years collecting and cross-referencing with topographic maps, geological surveys, and whatever oral accounts he could access. He was systematic in the way of an engineer rather than an archaeologist. Methodical, instrumented where possible, focused on the physical evidence rather than the narrative framework around it. He documented 14 locations where he observed what he described as passage openings showing evidence inconsistent with purely natural formation. The observations that matter at several of these locations, Lester noted what he described as a consistent angle of modification on the passage walls, a regularity in the surface treatment that he associated with deliberate toolwork rather than the irregular surface that mechanical erosion and fracturing in metamorphic schist would typically produce. Natural fracture surfaces in schist are rough, planar along the foliation, irregular in detail. What Lester described was different. A smoothness that was directional, that showed a consistent working angle, that suggested intention. At several locations, he noted that the floor surfaces showed a degree of smoothness inconsistent with the natural rock type. Schist and gneiss weather to rough, irregular surfaces. Smooth floors in metamorphic passages are not a natural outcome. They require either chemical dissolution, which would also produce distinctive wall features, or mechanical processing by human hands. At 2 locations, he observed passage orientations that showed an alignment with cardinal directions, north-south or east-west, that he calculated as statistically unlikely to occur by chance in passages of the length he was observing. Given the regional pattern of tectonic stress and foliation that typically governs the orientation of natural fractures in the area. And at one location in the Western Park, a location he described with sufficient geographic specificity that a research team with Lester's report and a topographic map could identify the general area. He observed what he described as a partially intact lintel doorframe cut from the rock, approximately 4 feet high and 2.5 feet wide. The remains of a threshold stone still in place. A lintel doorframe cut from rock is not a natural formation. Under no geological process does metamorphic schist produce a rectangular opening with a horizontal lintel and a threshold. If Lester's observation was accurate, it represented unambiguous evidence of constructed architecture at a pre-Columbian location in the Smoky Mountains underground. That observation has never been independently verified. Not because the location is inaccessible, not because the equipment for verification is unavailable, but because no mainstream researcher has returned to the location Lester identified to check his work. Lester's self-published report was circulated privately and later referenced in a small alternative archaeology journal that has since ceased publication. The journal article was never peer-reviewed in any mainstream sense. Lester himself died without seeing his findings formally evaluated. The location he described is still there. The mountains do not move on human timescales. Whatever Lester saw, whether his interpretation was accurate or mistaken, is still there, waiting for someone to go and look. What it would take a properly equipped team of archaeologists with a few days of field work could determine whether Lester's observation was accurate or a misidentification of a natural feature. The Western Smokies, despite the park's enormous visitor numbers, contain vast areas of wilderness that are rarely visited by anyone. The passage Lester described is not near a maintained trail. The reason this has not happened is not logistical. It is a matter of priority and institutional will. And institutional will, as we have seen, is shaped by factors that have nothing to do with the quality of the evidence, and everything to do with the categories within which evidence is permitted to be interesting. Harold Lester was not a credentialed researcher. His report was not produced within an institutional framework that would have given it automatic standing for review. And the communities that knew about his report, the small circle of independent researchers engaged with the tunnel question, lacked the institutional connections to bring it to the attention of people with the authority to act on it. The doorframe waits, the wilderness holds its silence, and the question accumulates another layer of unanswered years. When technology listens to the mountain ground penetrating radar is not exotic technology. It is a standard tool of archaeological survey, civil engineering, and geological investigation. It works by sending pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and reading the reflections that come back. When those pulses encounter boundaries between materials of different densities and electrical properties, the boundary between solid rock and an air-filled void produces a distinctive return signature. The technology is well understood, widely used, and scientifically legitimate. In the early 2000s, a small group of independent researchers, unaffiliated with any academic institution, operating without formal funding, using equipment that was not cutting edge by professional standards, conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey at several locations in the Smoky Mountains that had been identified in historical accounts as potential tunnel access points. Their findings, published on a website that has since become difficult to access in its original form, described anomalous subsurface features at multiple surveyed locations. Features that the radar return profiles suggested were enclosed spaces rather than solid rock, at depths ranging from a few meters to more than 20 meters below the surface. The 100-meter linear feature of the anomalies they documented. One is particularly difficult to explain through natural processes alone. At a location in the Western Park, a site that had been referenced in both Cherokee oral tradition and in a 19th century settler account. The radar survey detected what appeared to be a linear feature extending at a consistent depth for more than 100 meters before the equipment's range was exhausted. Natural fractures in metamorphic rock certainly extend for more than 100 meters. What is unusual about this feature is not its length, but its character. Consistent depth over that entire distance, and an orientation, the direction the feature runs through the rock, that does not match the regional stress field that controls the orientation of natural fractures in the area. In the Smoky Mountains, natural fracture networks generally follow the northeast to southwest orientation of the Appalachian structural grain. The direction in which the ancient mountain building forces compressed and deformed the rock, a feature that extends in a significantly different orientation at consistent depth over a substantial distance, is difficult to attribute to purely natural fracturing. It behaves like something that was made rather than formed. The independent researchers noted this. They also noted something else. The orientation of the anomaly they detected corresponded approximately to the orientation described in the Cherokee oral tradition they were working from, which pointed toward a passage aligned with the flow direction of a major creek in the area. The feature appeared to run parallel to the creek's course rather than across it, which would be consistent with a passage designed to follow underground water channels rather than to cross the grain of the terrain. Whether that correspondence is meaningful or coincidental cannot be determined from their data alone. The equipment they were using was not state-of-the-art. The interpretation of radar returns from complex metamorphic subsurface environments is genuinely difficult, and the possibility of misidentification of natural features is real. What the anomaly represents, at minimum, is a lead that has not been followed, a specific location with specific radar characteristics that warrants investigation by a properly equipped and institutionally supported research team. That investigation has not happened. What modern technology could find, the technology that was available to those independent researchers in the early 2000s was limited. What is available now is dramatically different. Lidar, light detection and ranging, uses airborne laser scanning to produce extremely detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain. When applied to forested areas, it penetrates the forest canopy to reveal surface features that are invisible from the air through conventional photography, earthworks, depressions, embankments, the subtle topographic signatures of ancient construction that have been overgrown for centuries. Lidar survey has transformed archaeology in the Maya lowlands, in the Amazon basin in Southeast Asia, repeatedly revealing the traces of civilizations far larger and more complex than anyone had previously suspected, hidden in plain sight beneath the forest canopy. Applied to the Smoky Mountains, which have never been subject to comprehensive Lidar survey for archaeological purposes. Lidar could reveal surface features that correspond to underlying passages, subtle depressions over collapsed sections, topographic anomalies above large underground voids, the kind of drainage pattern irregularities that Harold Lester's manuscript described as geological, witnesses to the underground system below, paired with modern ground-penetrating radar of professional specification, applied at locations identified by Lidar as anomalous, and guided by the geographic specificity of the Cherokee oral tradition accounts. A comprehensive survey of this kind would produce the kind of data that could either confirm or definitively refute the tunnel hypothesis. The technology exists. The question has not yet been asked of it. The Continental Crossroads. Why the Smoky Mountains mattered to understand why an underground passage network in the Smoky Mountains would have been both plausible and purposeful. We need to understand what the Smoky Mountains were in the pre-Columbian world, and that requires abandoning one of the most persistent and most damaging myths about pre-Columbian North America. The idea that the continent was populated by small, isolated communities living lightly on the land, each independently solving the basic problems of survival without meaningful connection to the larger world around them. This myth is not supported by the evidence. What the evidence shows, accumulated over a century of increasingly sophisticated archaeological investigation, is a continent crossed by trade networks of continental scope, sustained over periods of centuries, linking communities from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic seaboard to the Rocky Mountain foothills, in relationships of economic and cultural exchange that required the kind of social organization, logistical infrastructure, and institutional continuity that we typically associate only with complex societies. The material record of continental connection copper from the Lake Superior region, a very specific type of native copper, chemically and isotopically distinct from copper found anywhere else, appears at major ceremonial sites throughout the eastern United States, in burial mounds in Ohio, in ceremonial contexts in Florida, in ritual deposits in Georgia and the Carolinas. It traveled, in some cases, more than 1,000 miles from its source. Obsidian from the Yellowstone Plateau, a volcanic glass formed in one of the most isolated and geologically distinctive locations in North America, appears at Hopewell ceremonial sites in Ohio, 2,000 miles away. Marine shells from both the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic seaboard appear at inland sites hundreds of miles from the ocean. Specific ceramic traditions appear across regions far too large for the spread to be explained by local cultural diffusion alone. And mica, specifically the large sheet-form mica that occurs in the metamorphic schist of the southern Appalachians, and that was valued across an enormous geographic area for its reflective, light-catching properties and its associations with ritual and ceremonial practice, appears at major pre-Columbian ceremonial sites throughout the Midwest and Southeast in quantities that could only have come from Appalachian sources. The Smoky Mountains region is one of the primary Appalachian mica sources. It sits at a geographic nexus, at the point where the major ridge systems of the southern Appalachians converge, where the drainage from the Tennessee Valley side of the mountains meets the drainage from the North Carolina valleys, where the natural routes of movement through this section of the Appalachians come together before diverging again toward the Mississippi Valley, the Gulf Coast, and the Atlantic tidewater. The mountains were not a backwater in the pre-Columbian world. They were a hub, a node in a continental network through which materials, ideas, and people moved over periods of time so long that the network itself was ancient by the time European contact occurred. Where mining leaves its marks, mica extraction from the surface deposits of the Appalachian mica belt is straightforward. You find the glittering seams where weathering has exposed them, and you take what the surface offers. But surface deposits are finite. To sustain the volume of mica that appears at major ceremonial sites across the eastern United States, the quantities found at Hopewell sites alone represent a staggering amount of material. Surface extraction is not enough. At some point, the surface is exhausted, and the question becomes, how do you follow the seam underground? The answer is mining. Real mining, with real underground passages, cut into real rock, following the mica-bearing schist layer as it dips and curves into the hillside. The Cherokee were accomplished miners. Their oral tradition includes specific technical knowledge of subsurface extraction, of reading the rock, following mineral seams, preventing collapse, ventilating underground workings to maintain breathable air. This knowledge is documented in the ethnographic record. It was not an abstract or theoretical understanding. It was operational knowledge the kind that comes from doing the work. Documented pre-Columbian mining sites in the broader Appalachian Mica belt show evidence of underground work. Small passages, extraction pits, tool marks in the rock. These sites are acknowledged in the archaeological literature, though they are not prominently publicized, and they raise a straightforward question that has not been answered. How extensive were those workings? Were they isolated extraction points? Or did they connect into a larger network? The scale of pre-Columbian mica extraction from Appalachian sources was substantial enough that the underground footprint of that extraction must have been significant. But that footprint has not been mapped. The portions of it that have been identified tend to be small and isolated because the investigations that found them were not designed to look for a larger network. They found individual sites because individual sites were what they were looking for. Mining passages, unlike most other forms of human infrastructure, are extraordinarily durable. Cut into hard metamorphic rock and protected from surface erosion by being underground, a well-made mining passage can survive essentially intact for thousands of years if the mica extraction operations of the pre-Columbian Appalachians left significant underground footprints. And they must have. Those footprints may still be there. Where are they? And do they connect to the passages that the Cherokee oral tradition describes as a transportation and communication network threading through the mountains like veins in a body? We do not know, because we have not looked. The man who spent his life paying attention. There is a particular kind of intellectual vocation that does not fit within any institutional category, that operates at the margin of the documented world, accumulating the things that the official record ignores, building from decades of patient attention, a body of work that the systems organized around credentialed expertise have no mechanism to evaluate, and therefore no mechanism to value. Silas Cornstalk Birdsong was that kind of scholar. He lived for most of his adult life in a small house near the edge of the national park boundary in Swain County, North Carolina. He was of mixed Cherokee and Scots-Irish descent, a combination that was common in these mountains, and that gave him a double inheritance: the oral tradition of the Cherokee communities his grandmother had grown up in, and the documentary instinct of the Scots-Irish Presbyterian tradition that had produced generations of meticulous record-keepers in the Appalachian valleys. From roughly the 1940s to his death in the 1980s, Birdsong spent 40 years collecting every reference he could find to the underground passages of the Smoky Mountains. In newspaper archives, in county histories, in church records, in the oral accounts of elderly neighbors who had grown up with knowledge of the mountains before the establishment of the national park, in Cherokee language materials that he was one of a small number of non-tribal members capable of reading. He never published his findings in any conventional sense. What he produced was a hand-typed manuscript of approximately 400 pages, which he titled Beneath the Blue Smoke, a documentary history of the underground of the Smoky Mountains, where the manuscript lives copies of this manuscript exist in at least 4 locations. the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina, the Special Collections Library at Western Carolina University, the Archive of the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville, and the private collection of one of Birdsong's grandchildren. The manuscript has never been digitized. It has never been formally cataloged in any system that would make it discoverable through standard library searches. It has never been cited in any peer-reviewed publication. It is known to exist to a small number of independent researchers and to a larger number of Cherokee cultural heritage workers. But its contents have not been systematically evaluated by any mainstream academic institution. What is known of its contents comes from the researchers who have actually read it and from records of the occasional presentations Birdsong gave at local historical society meetings during his lifetime. What Birdsong found. In the section dealing with the 19th century settler accounts, Birdsong documented more than 60 distinct references to underground passages in the Smokies, drawn from primary documents spanning a 50-year period. He noted that these references clustered in two geographic areas: the Western Smokies in the region of the 20-mile drainage system, and the Eastern Smokies in the Cataloochee and Big Creek drainages. This clustering, Birdsong argued, was not coincidental. It reflected the locations of the major access points to the tunnel network. The points where the underground system came close enough to the surface to be accidentally discovered by people moving through the terrain. The clustering in the documentary record reflected the concentration of settlement and traffic that made discovery of the passages most likely in those areas. Where people were, discovery happened. Where people were not, the passages waited undiscovered and unrecorded. Birdsong also documented a series of Cherokee accounts that he had collected from elderly informants in the 1940s and 1950s. People who had grown up with direct knowledge of the mountains before the establishment of the national park and before the mass displacement of the communities that had lived in the park area. These accounts, according to records of his historical society presentations, described the underground network with considerably more specificity than any published sources. Specific entry points, specific passage orientations, specific features within the passages, including, in at least 2 cases, what the informants described as structures built within the passages: stone platforms, shelves of uncertain purpose, architecture within the underground, not just the underground itself. If those accounts were accurate, if someone, at some point, built stone platforms inside passages in the Smoky Mountain underground, the question of who built them and why is not merely interesting. It is transformative. It implies long-term habitation or sustained ceremonial use of those spaces. It implies a relationship to the underground that went beyond transit and extraction into something more fundamental. The underground as a place where certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of practice were maintained. The geological witnesses. The section of Birdsong's manuscript that most directly calls for expert evaluation is the one he titled "The Geological Witnesses." His term for the physical features of the landscape that he argued pointed toward the existence of the underground network, independent of any documentary or oral evidence. He documented patterns in the surface drainage that he argued were consistent with subsurface, karst, large dissolution features of a scale greater than anything formally documented in the Smokies region. He documented patterns in the vegetation that he argued reflected unusual groundwater conditions consistent with large subsurface voids. And he documented patterns in the topography that he argued were consistent with subsurface collapse features. The characteristic surface depressions that form when the roof of an underground passage or chamber loses structural integrity and fails. Birdsong was not a geologist. His reading of these landscape indicators may have been influenced by his prior commitment to the existence of the underground network. But the specific types of evidence he cited, drainage anomalies, vegetation patterns, collapse topography, are all legitimate proxy indicators for subsurface features. A geologist with knowledge of the regional geology could evaluate Birdsong's specific claims with a site visit and the existing geological maps of the region. Nobody has done this. Nobody has gone to the Museum of the Cherokee Indian or to Western Carolina University, read Birdsong's manuscript, identified his specific geological claims, and gone out into the field to evaluate them. The manuscript is there. The mountains are there. The expertise required exists, distributed across universities and research institutions within a day's drive of the park. The evaluation has not happened. Birdsong died without seeing his life's work taken seriously by the institutions that should have engaged with it. He knew what he had found. He knew what it meant. And he knew, in the way that people who live at the margins of official knowledge always know, that the knowing was not enough. The Secret Refuge, Survival, Secrecy, and the Underground. In the late 1830s, the Cherokee people, who had lived in the southern Appalachians for as long as any historical or oral record reaches, and who had maintained their relationship with this specific landscape across thousands of years of continuous habitation, were removed by force from their ancestral territory. The process known as the Trail of Tears was one of the most devastating events in the history of North American indigenous peoples. Approximately 16,000 people were forcibly evicted from their homes and marched to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died during the march and in the conditions that followed. Entire communities were shattered. The network of relationships, practices, and place-based knowledge that had sustained Cherokee civilization across millennia was torn apart in the space of a few brutal years. A small number of Cherokee people, perhaps a few hundred, managed to remain in the mountains of what is now the Qualla boundary in Swain and Jackson counties in North Carolina. They did so through a combination of legal maneuvering, the political protection of a sympathetic local, white trader named William Holland Thomas, and the accident of holding land titles that the state of North Carolina chose to recognize. They were a remnant, a community that had survived the unsurvivable, maintaining itself in the mountains it had always inhabited, reduced to a fraction of its former size and shorn of most of the social and material. infrastructure that had supported it. The underground as sanctuary. The Birdsong manuscript reportedly contains accounts drawn from oral traditions of the Eastern Band maintained into the 20th century that connect the underground passages directly to the survival of this remnant community during the removal period. According to these accounts, the underground network served as a physical sanctuary during the years when government troops were moving through the mountains to enforce the removal orders. The passages allowed people to move unseen, to travel from one part of the mountain terrain to another without exposure to search parties operating on the surface. They allowed dispersed families and community members to maintain contact through underground routes when surface movement was too dangerous to attempt. Whether these accounts describe historical events or represent a mythological framework applied retrospectively to the trauma of removal, the pattern of the community's survival narratives shaped by the existing tradition of the Nunnehi underground cannot be determined from available evidence. The distinction is, in any case, not as clean as it might seem. The oral tradition of the Nunnehi, with its descriptions of beings who sheltered humans in times of need and provided refuge in underground spaces, would have been the natural interpretive frame through which a community would have experienced and remembered any actual use of underground passages for shelter. If the passages were used as sanctuaries during the removal period, the effect on the transmission of knowledge about them would have been significant and lasting. A community that had used the underground network to survive a genocide would have very good reasons to restrict knowledge of that network to trusted insiders. The protection of the tunnel's existence from outside knowledge would not have been merely traditional practice. It would have been a survival imperative. And survival imperatives encoded in communities that have genuinely survived against extraordinary odds do not expire automatically when the immediate crisis ends. They become part of the community's identity, part of the understanding of what it means to maintain the knowledge that has always kept the community alive. The secrecy that surrounds the most specific knowledge of the Smoky Mountain underground. The secrecy that makes certain oral tradition accounts unavailable to outside researchers, that shapes the careful vagueness with which even sympathetic Cherokee cultural heritage workers discuss the tunnel question, is not incidental to the story. It is the story. It is what careful stewardship of sacred and dangerous knowledge looks like, maintained across generations by people who understood exactly why that stewardship mattered. A researcher who wants to understand the Smoky Mountain underground cannot approach it as a purely archaeological question. The knowledge lives in a community. The community has rights, protocols, and legitimate reasons for controlling access to what it knows. Any investigation that bypasses or overrides those rights, however well-intentioned, is not just ethically compromised. It is methodologically incompetent. It will miss precisely the information that would make the difference between finding something and understanding what it means. What the rock remembers. Hybrid formations and the physics of warm air. let us return to the thermal anomaly, the warmth that multiple independent observers across 2 centuries described as the quality that most surprised them about the passages they encountered. In a small, isolated natural cave in metamorphic terrain, the air temperature is stable, cool, and identical to the mean annual surface temperature of the surrounding landscape. In the Smoky Mountains, that is approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cool enough to be noticeably cold in warm weather, the stable enough across seasons to feel unchanging. What the historical accounts consistently describe is different. Air that was warmer than the surrounding environment, warmer than the observers expected, given the depth and the season. Not dramatically warmer, not the heat of geothermal activity, which does not characterize the Smoky Mountain geological environment, but warmer than it should have been. The physics of enclosed volume. There is a straightforward physical explanation for this, one that requires no extraordinary geology and no supernatural cause, but that does require a specific kind of underground system, a large, interconnected underground network, one with substantial volume, multiple connected chambers and passages, and sufficient biological activity in the form of decomposing organic material, microbial communities, and bat colonies, develops a thermal profile that is distinct from small isolated caves. The thermal mass of a large enclosed underground space, the capacity to retain heat, is enormous compared to the thermal mass of a small isolated cave. A large underground system buffers against surface temperature variation more effectively, and it retains the heat generated by biological processes within it. Decomposition, respiration, the metabolic activity of the communities of organisms that inhabit it, in a way that a small, isolated space does not. The result can be a measurable warmth that distinguishes a large connected underground system from a small isolated natural cave. Not geothermal heat, biological heat. The warmth of organic processes accumulated within an enclosed space of sufficient volume to retain it. An observer entering a large, interconnected underground system from a cool external environment would notice that warmth. They would comment on it because it would not match their expectations, and they would describe it in the terms available to them as something surprising, as a sign that the space they were entering was different from what they expected. This is consistent with what the historical accounts describe. Not proof. The accounts are not controlled measurements, and individual thermal perception is unreliable as a scientific instrument, but consistent. And consistency across independent accounts is a form of evidence, even when the evidence is soft. The underground river dimension. Several versions of the Nunnehi oral tradition describe the underground passages as following underground waterways, rivers and streams that flow through the mountains, below the surface. This is geologically accurate in a way that invites attention. In the marble lenses and fracture zones of the Smoky Mountains, groundwater does not diffuse evenly through the rock. It flows in concentrated channels, following the dissolution features in the marble, widening the fracture zones in the schist, creating subsurface streams that feed the numerous springs and seeps that characterize the mountain's surface hydrology. These subsurface streams can be substantial, carrying volumes of water that are significant by any measure. The tradition of passages following underground water is not only geologically sound, it describes the most sensible engineering approach for anyone who wanted to create navigable passages through this specific type of geology. Following an existing water channel means following the path of least resistance through the rock. The water has already done much of the work of finding the way through. Enlarging and modifying a water channel creates a passage that comes with natural drainage and a degree of environmental stability that dry passages lack. The Qanat systems of the Middle East, networks of underground channels constructed thousands of years ago to move water from mountain aquifers to lowland agricultural areas, work on exactly this principle. Some of them are more than 2,000 years old, and some portions remain functional today. The engineering logic is not exotic. It is the application of patient attention to what the landscape already offers. The major creek valleys of the Smoky Mountains run roughly perpendicular to the main divide of the range, cutting through the mountains from the Tennessee side to the North Carolina side in deep, narrow gorges. The underground drainage of the mountains follows the same general orientation. Passages that followed underground water would provide, in broad terms, the same mountain crossing routes that the surface creek valleys provide, but at a lower and more protected elevation. The Cherokee oral traditions specifically describes some of the underground passages as crossing the main divide of the mountains. The underground drainage system does exactly this. The alignment between what the tradition describes and what the hydrology produces is not coincidental. It is the signature of knowledge about actual features of an actual landscape, encoded in narrative form and transmitted across generations. Bringing light to the dark. What comes next? We have spent a considerable amount of time in the dark tonight. In the dark of the historical record. In the dark of the institutional silence. In the dark beneath the mountains themselves, following the accounts of the people who went into those passages and came back to write down what they saw. It is time to think about the light, the tools that would allow us to take this question seriously, to move from the accumulated pattern of evidence to the concrete physical knowledge of what is beneath the Smoky Mountains exist. They are not exotic. They are not experimental. They are the standard technologies of contemporary archaeological and geological survey applied to a location that has not yet received the attention it deserves. The technology that changes everything. Lidar has transformed archaeological survey in the last decade in ways that would have seemed extraordinary a generation ago. In 2018, a comprehensive LiDAR survey of the Maya lowlands in northern Guatemala revealed, beneath the forest canopy, the remains of a civilization that was dramatically larger and more complex than anyone had previously suspected. More than 60,000 previously unknown structures. An urban landscape of interconnected cities spanning thousands of square miles. A civilization that had been hiding in plain sight beneath the forest, invisible to conventional aerial photography and ground survey. The Smoky Mountains have never been subjected to a comprehensive Lidar survey oriented toward identifying pre-Columbian archaeological features. The park has been Lidar mapped for topographic purposes, but topographic Lidar mapping and archaeological Lidar analysis are different operations. The latter requires much higher resolution data and a specifically archaeological analytical framework applied to the resulting point cloud. What would a comprehensive archaeological Lidar survey of the Smoky Mountains reveal? We do not know. That is precisely the answer that would become available if the survey were conducted. What we can say, from the evidence that already exists, is that there are specific locations within the park where the probability of surface features corresponding to underground structures is elevated. The areas identified by Birdsong's analysis of the documentary record, the locations suggested by the oral tradition accounts, the sites where the independent radar survey detected anomalous subsurface features. These locations provide a starting point. The Lidar data would provide the next layer of information and might reveal features that no one has anticipated in locations no one has considered. The partnership that makes it possible technology alone is not sufficient. The Smoky Mountain Tunnel investigation that the evidence calls for is not simply a geological or archaeological exercise. It is a cultural and political undertaking that requires, as its foundation, the genuine engagement and genuine partnership of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. The Eastern Band maintains a tribal historic preservation office that manages the tribe's cultural heritage interests, including its interests in the national park, where federal law gives the tribe formal consultation rights regarding archaeological work. The tribe has shown increasing interest in documentation of its pre-removal cultural heritage, including the oral traditions and place-based knowledge that were disrupted, but not destroyed by the removal crisis of the 1830s. A research project developed in genuine partnership with the tribal community, incorporating indigenous knowledge as an equal partner alongside conventional scientific methods, respecting tribal protocols around sacred sites, sharing the results of investigation with the community on terms the community finds acceptable, would have both a stronger ethical foundation and, practically, better access to the specific local knowledge that could make the investigation more effective. The oral tradition that the Eastern Band maintains about the underground network is not merely cultural background. It is a research tool. It contains geographic information, specific enough and grounded enough in actual landscape features to guide a survey team toward the most productive locations. Accessing that information requires the kind of relationship that cannot be built by sending a research team into the park. With a ground-penetrating radar unit and a request for community consultation, it requires sustained engagement, demonstrated respect, and the willingness to accept the community's terms for how the knowledge is used and how the results are shared. That relationship building takes time. It is not glamorous. It does not produce the kind of dramatic discovery announcement that drives research funding cycles, but it is the necessary foundation for an investigation that would be both legitimate and effective. what the investigation would produce. Let us imagine briefly what it would mean to confirm the existence of the Smoky Mountain Tunnel network. It would mean formal recognition that the pre-Columbian peoples of the southern Appalachians, across thousands of years through multiple cultural periods, had invested in underground infrastructure of significant scale and complexity. Infrastructure that served both practical functions as a transportation and extraction system, and ceremonial functions as a sacred geography of the underground world. Infrastructure that placed these mountains at the center of a continental network, not at its periphery. It would mean a required revision of the standard account of pre-Columbian North American complexity, not a dramatic overturning, but a meaningful extension of the picture we already have of sophisticated, organized, infrastructurally capable indigenous societies. It would mean, for the national park, new management responsibilities and new opportunities for interpretation. The most visited national park in the United States would become also, say, in some dimension, an archaeological site of international significance, adding a dimension of human depth to what is already recognized as an extraordinary natural landscape. And it would mean, for the eastern band of Cherokee Indians, formal recognition of a dimension of ancestral land use that has been dismissed or ignored for more than a century. A recognition that the knowledge they maintained, through the disruption of removal, through the poverty and marginalization of the following decades, through the slow and ongoing process of cultural recovery, was knowledge of something real, something that is still there, something that belongs, in the deepest sense, to the community that has always known it was there. That recognition would not undo the history of dispossession and harm that produced the current situation. But it would be something, a form of restitution that takes the shape of truth, which is, in the end, the most durable form. The patience of stone there is something that happens when you take the deep history of a landscape seriously, not the history that begins with written records, or with the arrival of Europeans, or with the founding of the nation, but the real deep history, the history that extends back through the thousands of years of human habitation that preceded all of those events, and further back through the tens of thousands of years of human presence in North America, and further still through the hundreds of millions of years of geological process that created the physical world that human beings eventually arrived to inhabit. What happens is a fundamental shift in scale. The things that feel permanent to us, our institutions, our narratives about the past, our certainties about what is and is not possible in the human record, reveal themselves in the context of deep time as extraordinarily recent and extraordinarily provisional. The Smoky Mountains have been here for 300 million years. The Cherokee have been here for at least 1,000 years, probably much longer. The national park has been here for 90 years. The questions we ask about what lies beneath the mountains are, perhaps 50 years old, in any serious form. The mountains are not impressed by the brevity of our attention to them, but the people who lived in these mountains for the longest, who walked above the passages, who navigated their terrain with the intimacy of long habitation, who encoded their knowledge of what lay beneath into traditions that survived everything that history could throw at them. Those people are still here. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians is still here, maintaining a living relationship with the landscape that their ancestors inhabited, including the parts of that landscape that exist below the surface and have not been adequately investigated. The investigation this evidence calls for is not a treasure hunt. It is not an exercise in proving a sensational theory. It is not the confirmation of a conspiracy. It is the application of rigorous, well-resourced, collaborative scientific and historical inquiry to a question that has been asking to be asked for a very long time, and that has been set aside, not because the evidence was inadequate, but because the institutional structures of American academic culture were not organized to ask it. Those structures are changing. The recognition of indigenous intellectual sovereignty. The principle that indigenous communities have rights over the knowledge of their own cultural heritage. Rights that must be respected rather than circumvented by external researchers is becoming more firmly established in the practice of American archaeology and anthropology. The technological tools for non-invasive subsurface investigation have advanced dramatically. The public interest in pre-Columbian North American complexity is growing. The conditions for a serious investigation of the Smoky Mountain underground are, for the first time, approximately in place. What remains is the decision to make it happen. The institutional will, the funding, the relationships, and the commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads rather than where anyone expects to go. What we owe the dark, think about what it would have been like to walk through one of those passages in the dark. Not with a headlamp and modern equipment, with a torch, a burning stick, or a fat-soaked bundle that threw a circle of warm, trembling light, perhaps 10 feet in every direction, and beyond that, complete darkness, the weight of the mountain above you, the sound of deep water somewhere ahead or below, the walls, smooth or rough depending on which part of the system you were in, reflecting the torchlight in ways that the surface world never produces. No wind, no ambient light, no orientation cues from sky or horizon or distant landmarks. It is a profoundly different kind of experience from anything available on the surface. It changes your relationship to scale, to the enormous patience of the rock, to the smallness of a human body in relation to the geological forces that shaped the terrain. It changes your relationship to time, to the understanding that the passages you are walking through have been here for thousands of years, that others have walked them before you, that the tradition you are enacting is older than any living memory. Cultures that regularly inhabited and used underground spaces developed cosmologies that reflected that experience. The underground was not a metaphor for something else. It was a real place that inspired the metaphors, that gave the metaphors their weight, and their accuracy, and their persistence across generations. The Cherokee tradition of the Nunnehi, the parallel people who live below, who know what the surface world does not know, who offer refuge and healing in times of need, is not a story invented to Explain the inexplicable. It is a story that grew from the actual experience of people who went underground and came back changed. We owe that tradition the respect of taking it seriously, not as mythology, not as allegory, as what it is, a record imperfect and incomplete like all records, of actual engagement with an actual landscape, maintained across actual centuries by actual people who understood what they were, maintaining and why it mattered. The answer is still there. The blue smoke still rises from the ridgelines of the Smoky Mountains every morning. It will rise tomorrow morning, and the morning after, as it has risen, for as long as the forest has been there to breathe it into the sky. The tourists will come. The trails will be walked. The bears will move through the forest. At the margins of the maintained areas, the creeks will run. And beneath all of it, beneath the trails and the creeks and the tourist infrastructure and the wilderness, the rock will hold whatever the rock holds, with the patience that only rock can sustain, with the silence that is not emptiness but storage. The answer to the question of what lies beneath the Smoky Mountains is not lost. It is not gone. It is where it has always been, in the darkness below the surface, waiting for someone to bring a light that is adequate to the depth of the question, waiting for the combination of technology and relationship and institutional will that would allow us to finally ask the question properly, and to receive whatever answer the mountains are prepared to give. That combination is closer to existing now than it has ever been before, which means that the people listening to this tonight, wherever you are, whatever the time is, however deep into the night the mountains have taken you, are living in the generation that might actually find out. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The mountains breathe blue smoke into the sky each morning. The passages wait in the dark. The knowledge lives in the community that has always held it. The tools exist. The relationships can be built. The investigation can happen. All that is needed is the decision to begin. Rest well. The Smoky Mountains are still out there, keeping their secrets with patience that outlasts all of us. But perhaps not for much longer. Good night.